Thank you all for coming out tonight and braving this potential derecho storm that just missed us here in Washington, D.C. So it's always a pleasure to talk to people about the work that we do. And I want to give you some idea of the history of this research. So 40 years ago, I was an assistant professor at Indiana University. And I met the guy who was best friend at our wedding, Julie and our wedding, 26 years ago, Bob Levinson, who is now a psychology professor at the University of California in Berkeley. And Bob and I became friends right away. We love laughing together and laughing at ourselves mostly. And we started having coffee once a week. And our relationships, we found out with women, were not going very well. So basically, we were really two clueless guys about relationships. And so we decided that since we didn't understand how to have a good relationship with a woman, we might as well study it, So we built this lab that was really a lot of fun. We brought couples into this lab, and they, one of the reasons we worked together was Bob was a psychophysiologist, so we wound up both being interested in emotion and how emotion works in relationships. So we're looking at the physiological part of emotions, and we hooked people up to these sensors that measured the electrocardiogram, how fast their blood was flowing, how much they were jiggling around in their chairs, and how much they sweat from the eccrine glands of their palms. Those are glands that are very sensitive to psychological stimuli. We have them on our palms and the soles of our feet. And then we had this computer that really, the only job it did was synchronize the video time code to the psychophysiology. And it was about the size of 3 refrigerators, if you can imagine that. It does less than your cell phone does now. But this was in the 70s, way before personal computers came out. And the PDP-11 computer also collected all of the data. And we had couples come into this lab, and after they'd been apart for about 8 hours, and they talked about how their day went, and for about 15 minutes. And then we interviewed them about what they were arguing about, and then we asked them to take the top problem in their relationship and resolve it in the next 15 minutes. And then we had them talk about a pleasant topic from a list we gave them. And then we showed them their videotapes, and they turned this rating dial from very negative to very positive as they watched their tape to tell us what they were feeling, what their internal perception was of what was going on. So we had physiology and we had behavior we coded on the videotape. Now at this time, interestingly enough, in the early 70s, a guy named Walter Mischel had written a book where he basically said that psychology was in a bad place. The best that psychologists could do at predicting behavior using, the most refined personality measures of the time was accounting for about 9% of the variation. 91% of the variation in human behavior was completely a mystery. And what Mischel said was, that's pretty bad and unacceptable. We have to do better. And of course, we were getting evaluated for tenure and promotion, and our senior colleagues said, well, you guys are crazy to study a couple, because if you can't predict one person's behavior, how are you going to predict 2 people's behavior? You'll just square the error. You'll never find out anything. You'll never get a grant. Even if you get results, it won't replicate. This is crazy. Don't do this research. So we decided to do the research, of course. We were very curious about this. Now, let me give you some idea of where psychology was and couples therapy was at the time. So a book had come out called The Intimate Enemy, and it was written by this guy named Dr. George Bach. And what Dr. Bach suggested for couples therapy, he said the problem in marriages is that people suppress their anger and resentment. So his therapy consisted of having 2 partners face one another, and they would take turns standing up and saying what they resented about their partner. And he actually gave them these foam rubber bats that he marketed, called batakas, that they would whack each other with, So, I might stand up, if Julie and I were the clients, I might stand up and whack her and say, I resent not having enough sex. And then I would sit down and she might stand up and say, I resent you're not helping enough in the house. And then I would stand, and we do this for an hour. And then we would write Dr. Bach a check. That was the therapy. It was a whole therapy. And after hundreds of studies, people discovered that there is no catharsis effect for anger, getting it out, it's not like clearing your throat, because actually when you do that for an hour, you leave more resentful than when you came in, So it really doesn't work. So there were a lot of hypotheses about what made relationships work that were kind of floating around at that time in the early 70s when we started doing this research. Another one was that what went wrong in relationships, this guy suggested, his name was Don Jackson. He was a very famous psychiatrist, and he wrote this book called The Mirages of Marriage, which is a wonderful title. And he said what goes wrong is that in a good relationship, there's an implicit contract that if I do something nice for Julie, she will reciprocate and do something nice for me. But in a relationship that isn't going well, that contract gets violated. He called that the quid pro quo, something for something in Latin. And so that was a whole therapy that really got started. And behavioral psychologists started this reciprocal contracting idea. And people would have these contracts. And I'm not making this up, this is really true. So there was an article published that said, this was a very successful therapy because the couple made a contract that he would take out the garbage Friday morning in exchange for getting fellatio Friday night. And that was the therapy, So you don't have to be too sensitive to see that maybe that therapist is missing the boat a little bit, about what's wrong with that relationship. And in fact, in 1977, a guy named Bernard Merstein published a paper in which he said and discovered that this quid pro quo way of thinking, I'm giving a lot and I'm not getting a lot back, that way of thinking was actually characteristic of ailing relationships, not good relationships. And ailing friendships, not only ailing marriages. So we don't become emotional accountants until things go bad. Now, all these books had been written by therapists, and therapists, of course, see couples who are in trouble, right? So they have to imagine what a great relationship looks like. But Bob and I were studying really good relationships, and we didn't really expect to find very much. We just thought it'd be really interesting to see what we learned. And we found, when we recontacted the couples 3 years later and found out how happy they were and how they had changed in their happiness. Some couples had really dropped in marital happiness during that 3-year period. Some had increased, some had stayed the same, but mostly they really either increased or decreased. And we found we could predict whether they would go one way or the other, not with 9% accuracy, but with 90% accuracy. So this was really, we were probably the most surprised about that result than anybody. I still remember the phone call when Bob called me up, and in those days there was one computer at every university. Nobody had a computer, and it would take you hours to get results. You bring these big, heavy IBM cards to a window. So when Bob got the results, he called me up and said, "Have you ever gotten results like this?" And I said, "Never." So we were pretty excited, because what we found was that the couples whose relationships got more miserable over time, regardless of how happy they were when they started, had blood that was flowing faster, hearts that were beating faster, they were sweating more and jiggling around more. So that being calm when you're talking about a conflict was a good thing. In fact, we found out when we coded the videotapes about what they were saying that, in fact, Dr. Bach was completely wrong. The masters of relationships, rather than airing resentment, were very gentle with one another. They were kind. They were considerate, right? And in fact, the first thing we looked at was, how many seconds did the couple spend during a conflict discussion, or even when they talked about how the day went, how many seconds did they spend being nice to each other, being interested in one another, being kind, being respectful, being empathetic, laughing together, being affectionate, All the positive stuff, divided by how many seconds did they spend being hostile, angry, disappointed, hurt, confronting one another. And we found that the couples whose relationships got better, that ratio of positive to negative, even during conflict, averaged 5 times as much positive as negative in relationships that got better over time. And the relationships that got worse over time, that ratio of positive to negative was 0.8. Just a little more negativity than positivity. Still a lot of positivity. Almost could say, well, it's balanced. So we realized that for a relationship to really feel good and get happier over time, it has to be a very rich climate of people being nice to each other. Just the opposite of what Dr. Bach was doing, right? And, and later on, people also discovered the quid pro quo was wrong. People don't, in relationships that are going well, don't give in order to receive. They just give, And, and it kind of works out, when you're being altruistic and positive. So that was the first thing we discovered, that ratio really was very interesting. Now, when I got to the University of Washington about 27 years ago, I built an apartment lab, which was kind of like this lab that Bob and I built, and Bob helped me build it. But it was kind of designed to be like a bed and breakfast getaway. It was on the medical school campus, and there was a great picture window, and boats were going by, and there was a park, and there were ducks and geese in the park, and so it was a very nice setting, very beautiful setting. And the only difference between a usual bed and breakfast and this one was that there were 3 cameras bolted to the wall and that followed all their movements, and they wore Holter monitors that measured electrocardiogram. And when they urinated, we took a urine sample to measure stress hormones. And we took blood from them to look at the immune system. And people were in the other room coding their emotions. But aside from that, it was a very relaxed sort of bed and breakfast kind of setting. And they spent 24 hours there, we just had the cameras rolling, right? And so let me give you some idea, we did this study over and over again, that same study. In fact, we not only studied heterosexual couples, but we also spent 12 years studying gay and lesbian committed couples. And we found the same thing, the same sets of things discriminated the masters of relationship from the disasters. And by disasters, we mean people who break up or stay together and are really unhappy, but they stay together. So it was very important from a research point of view to be able to discriminate those 3 kinds of couples: happy couples, couples who stay together but are miserable, and people who break up, divorce if they're married. And we could do that very well with very high accuracy. So not only did this ratio predict, but then we kind of asked, well, are all negative things equally corrosive? And what we discovered was really that the disasters present their problems and argue in a completely different way than the masters. And we were able to identify 4 things that were really different. And I called them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And this is, akin to the New Testament and Revelations. There are 4 horsemen that accompany the destruction of the world, and there are things like pestilence and famine and war. But in the case of a couple's conversation, those 4 things, first of all, were how they started presenting a problem. And the disasters basically pointed their finger at their partner and said something like, I've been watching you, and as far as I can tell, I'm pretty much perfect, but you are defective. And this relationship is not going to get happy until you get therapy and change. And they would, have all these criticisms about what was wrong with their partner's character or personality. Now, the critic really expected that people would respond to this, what they saw as constructive criticism, by saying something like, John, thank you so much for pointing out all the ways in which I'm failing as a human being. You are so intelligent. Can we have lunch next week and you can tell me all the other ways in which I'm a failure? And that's what the critic kind of expected. But instead, they got the 2nd horseman, which was defensiveness, right? So let me tell you what the masters did instead of pointing their finger at their partner. Instead of that, what the masters would do when they started a conflict discussion is they would start very gently. They'd point the finger at themselves, and they'd say, they'd minimize the problem. They'd say something like, this is kind of weird being in this psychology lab and, having to say, talk about our, major conflict. And because I really don't think there's a lot wrong with you or me or the relationship. It's really fine. But there is one thing, now that we're here, might as well have a good conversation. So what the heck? I guess, one thing that I would really like is when you come home from work, you put away the cell phone and the BlackBerry and the computer and just hang out with me and ask me how my day was. And that would be just great. So they were really pointing their finger at themselves and saying what they needed, and it was a lot easier to hear, than, the sort of finger pointing. And because defensiveness would be the next horseman of the apocalypse, and that was either a counterattack and say, oh, you're not so perfect, let me tell you what you do wrong, and there'd be, an escalation of the criticism, even a bigger criticism, I don't balance the checkbook. Well, guess what? You're not a very good father. Like a really big one, really big criticism. And it would escalate, keep going like that, right? Or, the other way of being defensive was to act like an innocent victim and whine, and sort of be basically saying something like, I can never do anything right with you. Everything I do is wrong. I can never please you. I never get any acknowledgement or appreciation for what I do. That sort of feeling sorry for yourself kind of attitude. And some people were so good at defensiveness, they could combine the two. They could be an innocent victim and counterattack as well at the same time. Now, what the masters were doing was something entirely different than defensiveness. Even if their partner started with some criticism, they would say, yeah, it's interesting. That's a good point. Maybe I was kind of grumpy, that night. I really should put away my cell phone and my computer and hang out with you. You're right. I really, work is getting in the way. Tell me more about what's bugging you about my being on the phone. Because a lot of times I just don't have any choice, And they have this great conversation, because they're taking responsibility, even for a small part of the problem. And it's amazingly powerful. We've discovered that taking responsibility when your partner's upset, and saying, that's a good point, that's interesting, tell me more, I want to understand why you're unhappy, why you're in pain right now. That's huge, especially for men. When a woman does that for a guy, as opposed to saying, the whole problem is you, when she says, it's not all you, it's me, it's you, and we're busy, it's not our fault, but yeah, it's partly you. That's music to a guy's ears, especially, because they always feel like they're getting nailed, kind of like a butterfly getting pinned, to a corkboard. They're sort of, they're the ones, the most terrifying thing a guy can hear are the 7 words, we need to talk about our relationship, right? It's the last thing a guy wants to hear, especially at night after work. So taking responsibility is very, very powerful, and that's what the masters are doing. Even when there's a bit of criticism. Now, the third horseman was what we call contempt. And contempt is different from criticism. It's really like acting superior to your partner. If you think you're better than your partner in any dimension, like you're more punctual, you're tidier, you're better informed about some topic, anything like that, you'll speak down to your partner. And what comes out is usually an insult or a put down or some derogatory term, and it feels very appropriate at the moment to use that term for your partner. But it actually turns out that contempt is our best predictor of divorce in heterosexual couples. The masters basically don't do it. It's essentially 0 for the masters. And it not only predicts the demise of relationships, but it predicts how many infectious illnesses the recipient of contempt will have in the next 4 years. So the Glazers at Ohio State University actually discovered among newlyweds that contempt and other codes that are sort of similar to it in the marital interaction coding system that was done at the University of Oregon, that the couples that did a lot of that, when they took blood from them and looked at the white blood cells, that in fact T lymphocytes didn't proliferate as well in response to an antigen. And natural killer cells, which are kind of our police force against tumors, weren't as cytotoxic, weren't as able to kill tumors in the blood of these very young, healthy people, newlyweds, when there was contempt and codes like contempt. So we know that, we know the mechanism by which there's a degradation of the immune system. In fact, the couples who use contempt, the Glazers found they secrete more adrenaline while they're arguing. And you can predict, just from the amount of adrenaline in the blood during a conflict discussion, how that relationship is going to be 10 years later. So you start with newlyweds, and the amount of adrenaline predicts that it's going to be a bad relationship 10 years from now. If there's not much adrenaline, it'll be fine. If secreting adrenaline, it's a very bad thing. So contempt is a very powerful thing. And it became one of my hobbies to start collecting ways in which people were contemptuous. One of my favorite was correcting somebody's grammar when they're angry with you. I think that's a really great way. So, you know, if Julie says, I could care less about that, you know, and we're in the middle of discussing a conflict, I would say, Julie, you know, just a minute. It is not, I could care less. The proper way to say that is, I couldn't care less. Now, what was your point? See, this is sort of the professor way of being contemptuous. And when we went to Kentucky, we found that in Kentucky they have a particular way of being contemptuous. You can say anything rotten about another human being in Kentucky, like you can say to your friend, look at that woman who just came in. Doesn't she realize she looks like a slut in that dress? Bless her heart. So if you say bless her heart, you can say the most rotten thing about people in Kentucky. I don't know if that's true anywhere else in the South, but it is, okay. So, you know, it's really interesting to see how different cultures are contemptuous. The French are really great at it, you know. If you go to Paris, tell them you're an American, you'll receive French contempt. Or bring a baby to a bistro. Poodle is all right, but not a baby. And the British are very contemptuous. They do that in their parliament. They sort of mock each other and make fun of each other. So contempt became one of my hobbies, and because it's so powerful at destroying relationships. Now the masters were doing something entirely different. They were, instead of contempt, they were doing something very complicated. They were creating in the relationship a culture of appreciation and respect. And they were doing it in very small moments. You know, they were basically, I think the difference between the masters and the disasters here on this contempt horseman was that the masters had a different habit of mind. They were scanning their social environment, you know, and their families at home for things they could appreciate, things they were trying to catch their partner doing something right. And they would say, thank you, you know, and they would say it in very small moments, you know, they just say, you know, I really enjoyed the conversation at dinner. Thanks for making the bed. Thanks for doing the dishes. That was a delicious meal. Boy, you are such a creative cook. And they'd say stuff like that. You know that teacher conference we had last week, you know, it was amazing the way you dealt with that teacher. She was such a battle axe. She scared me. I felt like I was 6 years old, but you handled it so well. So they're communicating admiration, pride, and respect in their partner. And whereas the disasters were scanning their social environment for other people's mistakes and commenting on them constructively, they thought, right? And they're doing that with their kids as well. And when we started looking at parent-child interaction, the same people were, when they try to teach their kids something, they wait for the kid to make a mistake and then they go, that was wrong, you did wrong there, that was wrong. Let me tell you what you needed to do. You need to fix that. You can't act like that. Whereas the masters would teach their kids a very different way. They teach them something, you know, give them a little bit of information, wait for them to get something right, then they come in and say, you're getting it. That's great. Let me give you a little more information, you know, and then they'd stand back again. And in one case, the performance of the kid went up and up. And in the criticism case, it just went down and down. So in general, there's no such thing as constructive criticism. And yet our society really believes that this is, you know, this is characteristic of, you know, the intelligent person. And we call logical thinking in our schools critical thinking. We don't call it logical thinking. We want our kids to be critical thinkers, you know. And we think that somebody who goes around appreciating things in the world must be a complete idiot, right? It's only the intelligent person who's skeptical, right? So our society supports this negative habit of mind. But in fact, research shows that the masters, the positive habit of mind, actually those guys rather than seeing the world through rose-colored glasses, they're actually seeing the world more accurately. So studies that have looked at how much positive interaction is going on between people, when you have the partners doing it as well as outside observers, it's the people who are happy with one another who actually are the same as outside observers. Whereas unhappily married people miss 50% of the positivity. Just goes by. They don't notice it, see? So actually this positive habit of mind is not distorting reality. It's the negative habit of mind that's distorting reality. People look for other people's mistakes. They find them everywhere, right? And they feel like they're just perfect and other people are defective. Very bad way to think, because it winds up leaving you kind of irritable but feeling superior to other people. Okay, and that's the mistake of contempt. Now the fourth horseman of the apocalypse was something we call stonewalling. And what we saw in the Masters, well, you know, if you watch people talk to each other, you'll notice that the listener usually, and this is true in a lot of cultures in the world, is doing a whole lot of things to show the speaker that he or she is tracking the speaker. They keep their bodies open, they maintain eye contact, they nod their heads, they move their facial muscles, they utter these vocalizations. Yeah, could be. Oh yeah, oh, all right. Oh, no, wow, oh, okay, yeah. But the stonewaller doesn't do that. Stonewaller, none of that is there. They fold their arms like this, look away and down. No facial movement, no vocalization, no head nodding. Okay. Now, the person stonewalling really looks like they disapprove of what you're saying when you're a speaker. So what happens is that when you look at couples interaction, somebody starts stonewalling, the speaker does a whole bunch of things. One, they try to repair, they say, come on, they're trying to say, come on back, you know, come on, you know, don't withdraw. And you know, and they'll say, you know, really, it's not so bad, really, relax, you know, everything's okay. Or the other thing they do is they say to themselves, you know, that 10-pound cannonball is just not working. Let's try the 25-pound, boom, and they escalate their negativity, right? Oh, I'm still not getting through. Okay, let's try a bigger load, you know. And so the conflict escalates. Stonewalling, you know, is really not effective at doing anything. Now, we're really interested in the stonewalling because in heterosexual couples, 85% of the time, stonewallers were guys. It seemed to be a guy thing to do. So Bob and I really wanted to know, if we studied lesbians, do lesbians stonewall, or is this just a kind of a male thing to do? Nope, lesbians stonewall, absolutely. Okay, so we didn't really understand what stonewalling was about. But then we found that an elevated heart rate above 100 beats a minute increased the ability to predict stonewalling in the next 10 seconds. Okay, so stonewalling must have something to do with self-soothing. And we started, okay, you know, we'll go back to our subjects, we'll bring them in, we'll show them the tape, and we'll say, what are you thinking in this moment? And they could tell you what they were thinking really clearly. And this is kind of what's going through the mind of a guy who's stonewalling. Okay, just shut up. Don't say anything, you'll make it worse. Every time you say something, you make it worse. Just keep your mouth shut. How long can she go on like this? A woman's going to give herself a heart attack. I could say something now. It happened 6 years ago. God, she never forgets a thing. Don't say anything. You'll just make it worse. Keep your mouth shut. It's 10 minutes to the game. She can't touch me then. That's what's going on in the mind of a stonewaller, you know. It's a kind of self-soothing monologue, like, you know, cool out, you know, don't make it worse, you'll just ruin it, you know, you never know what to say to please her. And, you know, and the masters, what they're doing when they get physiologically aroused is very different. What they do a lot of times is they do, you know, what this one guy we saw on a tape, they were talking about his being late all the time, and his wife is kind of telling him, you know, I really think the reason you're late all the time is because your mother left you waiting for hours when you were a kid. And he starts getting really upset. Yeah, you know, I think you're right. I really hated her, and, you know, boy, that was tough as a kid. And he's starting to stutter a little bit, and you see his heart rate go up in the control room, right? And then this guy says, say, what about those shoes? And she says, well, they weren't very expensive shoes. And he says, no, but they're pretty shoes, really nice shoes. Yeah, thank you. Well, are you gonna wear those shoes to the dinner party this weekend? Well, I thought I might. So you have something to go with them? No? Well, you should get something to go with them. And his heart rate's coming down as he's doing this, right? And then after a while he says, so about my being late, and he gets back to it with a lower heart rate, right? He hangs in there. And, or, on other tapes, the partner kind of sees him, or sees her, getting physiologically aroused. Maybe she's getting red, or she's getting upset, or she's stonewalling, a little bit, and he just cracks her up. He says something that makes her laugh, or she says something that makes him laugh. And when they're laughing together, the heart rate goes down. So that's what the masters are doing. They're controlling heart rate. And humor is one of the most powerful things to control heart rate. So let me summarize. So we can predict, and this was 23 years of research, we can predict, and we weren't helping anybody, right? And, we were getting paid by our universities to watch people deteriorate, and getting a good salary, and we actually found in our data that if people got therapy, they were more likely to break up than if they got no therapy at all. So we were kind of scared to help anybody, right? But then 17 years ago, Julie and I were in a canoe, and she said, "Why don't we team up and form an institute? And let's really try to help people with this research you've done." And I said, "I don't really want to help anybody, I'm doing okay, and I don't want to be like all those guys that tried and failed." And she said, "No, I think we should help people." So, we had two different points of view, and so we compromised and decided to help people. And that's sort of the way our marriage works, we actually had this big conflict about whether or not to get a dog, and I was scared of dogs. I didn't like dogs, and Julie had grown up with Welsh Corgis, and she loved dogs, and I said, absolutely not, no dog, we're not getting the dog. And she said, absolutely, we're getting a dog. So we discussed it intimately, and for hours and years, and we compromised and got a dog. And the first dog we got, I lost my fear of dogs. And now the dog we have, Kobe the Corgi, he and I are buddies. And that's the way things work in our marriage. Now, so we decided we were going to help people. And the first thing we needed to do in order to do that was to take all these predictions and try to create a theory that could be disconfirmed, not a theory like psychoanalysis that just live forever regardless of the data, but one we could modify over time. Because, like one thing we discovered was humor was so important in reducing physiological arousal and predicting good things in relationships. So how do you use that to help people? Can you say to a couple, the next time you talk about his mother, that awful argument you had, try to laugh and smile more next time. It just doesn't work, right? They're going to say, you don't know his mother, she's not funny, right? So how do you get people to laugh and smile more, when they're in the middle of argument? And we needed a theory for that. And Julie's going to tell you about that theory. That's great.
All righty. So you see our theory on these two screens. And it was really, really easy to create a theory. All we needed to do was look at the masters. We definitely didn't look at our marriage. We weren't one of those kind of guru type couples that just say, well, we have the truth, so we will give you the truth. Instead, what we did is we learned everything from the couples that we were watching, the real masters of relationship. So let me tell you a little bit about our theory. We call it the Sound Relationship House. And I will start at the bottom and build up. So when we looked at the real masters, here were some of the things that they were exceptional at. Number one, the bottom level, they built love maps. Now, what the heck is a love map? When you think about how to get from point A to point B, you've got to figure out what are the landmarks. How do you get there? And you're asking a question. How do I get from point A to point B? Well, how do you get from partner A to partner B? How do you build knowledge of your partner's internal world? Because that's part of the foundation of a good relationship. You have to know who your partner is. How do you find that out? You need to ask questions. So we call that building love maps. So when you think about, if you're in a relationship, how well do you know your partner? Do you know your partner's most embarrassing moment in childhood? Do you know your partner's favorite novel? Do you know your partner's favorite music group or composer? You have to ask questions. And the cool thing about relationships is that over time, the questions have different answers. Because we evolve, we change, we mature, we develop, we have kids. That changes all the answers to everything in the world. What's your favorite novel? I don't know, I haven't read one in 12 years, right? So you have to keep asking those questions. One of the ways that John and I tried to practice that was when we were living in Seattle, there was this beautiful, beautiful hotel. And we couldn't afford, of course, to do very much in the beginning. And this particular hotel had the most beautiful lobby. It had this stone fireplace. It had a beautiful couch in front of it. Lights were low. It was so romantic. So we, on a date night, would go in there, and we would sit on the couch, and we would pretend we were guests. And we would order like a glass of wine, and we would sip the one glass of wine all night, which was cheap, and we would ask each other questions like, what are you thinking about your next research project? Or, if you could do anything to our house, how would you change it? Or, what kind of traits from your family would you like our daughter to inherit? These wonderful, big, open-ended questions. And those questions were so moving. We could talk about one question all night long. And when we went on those dates, of course, John brought his yellow notepads, and he'd be like taking notes, right? And then he would code the answers later. So I had to be very careful. What did I say? Let's see. So building love maps is really key. And when we looked at the disasters, let me give you one example in terms of love maps. We had one couple who came through the lab. This was amazing. They'd been married for about 12 years. They'd moved into a new house 3 years ago. And the husband was a neonatologist, so he studied premature babies and he took care of premature babies, who sometimes could be very ill. So he was at the hospital sometimes 20 hours a day. So 3 years they'd lived in their new house. He didn't know where the back door was. He only came in and out the front door. He didn't know the name of the family dog that they'd had for 2 years. Did he know the names of his kids' best friends? Not a chance. There's a couple who is so emotionally disengaged, they don't know each other at all. They're two very isolated and lonely human beings. So it's that building of connection through asking each other questions that's a really fundamental part of the foundation of what creates a good relationship, right? Okay, so if we move up to the next level, it's called sharing fondness and admiration. So what do we mean by that? Well, hopefully we fall in love with our partners, we really see so much good in them, we really love their characteristics and so on. Now, the question is, does it come out of your mouth? There's the story of the guy from Minnesota who loved his wife so much for 27 years, he almost told her. So this doesn't work. You can't hold it inside your head, right? And just think it. Or hold it inside your hands and hold your hands back, right? We can't do that and build a close relationship. So what's really important is letting our partners know that we love them, that they are beautiful to us, that we see their hearts and their hearts are the size of Ohio, that we admire how intelligent they are. We have to let our partners know what we see in them, the good we see in them, and we have to do that every single day. It's really important to do that. Another part of sharing fondness and admiration is also sharing appreciation. So, there's how many times, for example, has one of you in a relationship been cooking dinner? Every night? For how many months? For how many years? Right? Sometimes decades. How many times do you hear, God, that was good, thank you? We need to hear that all the time. So we need to hear appreciation. One of the things that I love about John, I totally love this. This is like, if you want a good relationship, just tell your partner to do this. Every morning he empties the dishwasher. Every morning he makes coffee. What else do you need? Especially if you live in Seattle. You have to have coffee, right? So, it's so wonderful that he does that, and I try and thank him for that, as often as I can. Even though he already knows I'm grateful, I give him a little more gratitude. So that's part of building a good, strong base for your relationship. So let's move up to the third level. It's called turning towards versus away. So this one is just amazing. It is so easy to change. This we saw in the apartment lab. We were trying to figure out, couples were not necessarily fighting when they were 24 hours in the apartment lab. They might be, one would be doing the dishes, one would be reading the newspaper, watching TV. So, what was it that was differentiating the disasters from the masters? Well, here's what it would look like. See if you can figure out which one works. So one of them would be looking out the big picture window at the beautiful, creek going by or the water going by, and there'd be a boat out there kind of sailing by. And one partner would say, "Oh, wow, look at that boat." The partner might do the following. Reading their book. Or the partner might do this. Would you stop interrupting me? I'm trying to read. Or the partner might do, Which do you think works? Is the one that works. That's all it takes. It's so simple. So what we mean by turning toward versus turning away or turning against is that when one person makes a bid for a connection, like, wow, look at that beautiful boat, or, hey, George, I want to show you something, or, honey, could you help me here? If the partner chooses to turn towards the other, and I'm not just talking, like physically turn their body, but just say, okay, or sure, what do you need? Any way of responding to the partner's bid for attention or the partner's request with a response is turning towards. And then there's enthusiastic turning towards, which is, oh, that is an incredible boat. Wouldn't it be so cool to get a boat like that and sail around the world? God, when can you retire? So that's an enthusiastic turning toward, right? So turning toward is so fundamentally important. So let me give you a little example. John talks about this sometimes. There's a book out there that's called 1,001 Ways of Being Romantic. And number 24, on page 24, the suggestion is give your partner a gold locket with your picture in it. So imagine giving a partner this beautiful locket with your picture in it. Only you haven't asked your partner a question in 15 years. And when your partner is at a party and she starts to tell a story, you say, "Oh, honey, don't tell that story. You don't tell it very well. Let me do it." And when your partner asks you to please pick up the dry cleaning, "No, I'm too busy." And then you give her a gold locket with your picture in it. What is she going to feel? What is she going to think, right? She's going to take the SUV, put the thing on the driveway, and drive over it a few times, kind of smash it down into the cement. So, you don't have the foundation for romance, for passion, unless you have these first 3 levels of the Sound Relationship House. So they create friendship. Not only that, but these 3 levels also correlate very, very highly to good passion, romance, and sex in the relationship. So it's very difficult to maintain romance and passion unless those 3 levels are strong. Does that make sense to you? Yeah? Okay. All right, so let's move up to the next level. You'll see it's called the positive perspective versus the negative perspective. So let me tell you something about that. If people have either had a very, very distant relationship for some time, or they've had horrible, horrible fights where there's been lots of criticism, lots of contempt and defensiveness over and over and over and over and over again. What ends up happening is people may move into the negative perspective with each other, which means that they assume their partner is going to be attacking them. They assume their partner doesn't care about them. They assume their partner is critical of them, no matter what the partner says. We call that the negative perspective. It's almost like in the relationship, there's a filter between each of the partners. There's a filter over their eyes. And when the negative perspective is there, that filter really is gray. It makes the person only see a negative feeling in the relationship. They don't see the positive, they see the negative. Versus the positive perspective, which is when that friendship is operating well and conflict is being managed well, then what you see is that people will give each other the benefit of the doubt. So if somebody is really, really grumpy and comes downstairs and they're grumpy and they say, "God, this kitchen is a mess again," the other person, when they're in the positive perspective, may say to himself, "Uh-oh, she must have had a bad night of sleep. Well, I understand. I'll just step back just a little bit. And hopefully she'll get a good night's sleep tonight." That's the positive perspective, right? But when you're in the negative perspective, somebody comes downstairs in a decent mood and says, "Honey, would you mind cleaning up the kitchen this morning before you go to work? Stop trying to control me." Whoa, negative perspective. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, the positive perspective and the negative perspective you cannot work on directly. You can't tell a couple, be more positive or be more negative. You have to work on either those first 3 levels or the top levels in order to change that perspective. So it's kind of where the Sound Relationship House kind of folds in half, right there. It's affected by both what's below it and what's above it. So let's move up. You see, manage conflict. Now, one of the things that came out in John's research was just an amazing finding, and most people feel relieved about this, though there's kind of a sigh as they hear it. 69% of all problems in relationships, in marriages, are unsolvable. They are perpetual. They will never, ever go away. They will never change. Oh my God. They're based on differences in personality or differences in preferred lifestyle, right? So one person may be, as in our relationship, John calls me obsessively, compulsively neurotic, meaning I'm neat and tidy, and he is charmingly sloppy. So that will be our perpetual issue forever and ever and ever. And there was one amazing family therapist. He really started the field of family therapy, called Salvador Minuchin. And he said, quote unquote, every marriage is a mistake. Uh-oh. Does that doom us? No. It depends on what you do with the mistake, right? What you do with it, how you handle it. So 69% of all problems are perpetual problems. They never go away. Now, when we studied couples who were having conflicts, as they were having conflicts, we noticed there were a number of different skills that they applied when they were real masters of relationship, even when they were talking about big perpetual issues that just were driving them nuts. So, one of the things is they would use what's called softened startup. So they wouldn't bring up, as John was pointing out, they wouldn't bring up the problem with a criticism. They would bring it up in this way. I feel something. I feel upset, stressed, I feel angry, I feel worried, I feel desperate, I feel enraged. They might feel really angry. That was okay. Anger wasn't the problem. I feel about what? Wouldn't be about who, it would be about what. I'm angry that there's a dent in the car. I'm upset that the bills haven't been paid. I'm really worried that our daughter isn't getting picked up on time. So they would name about what as just kind of the fact of something, as opposed to, again, as John said, pointing the finger and blaming. I'm upset that you're such an idiot. You can cheat on this stuff too. Do it perfectly. I feel that you are really lazy. That doesn't work. That doesn't work, right? So they get away from you. I feel what emotion, and then about what situation. Finally, step 3, they would say, I need, or would you please, which was so important. We Americans, of course, are so autonomous and independent that we don't have any needs, right? Except that we actually do. Because we're pack animals. We depend on each other. That's our reality. So it's okay to have needs. There's no such thing as too needy. No such thing. People have fundamental needs. They need to feel connected to each other. They need to be able to lean on each other. They need to ask for what they want from each other. So here's what people would say. Instead of, let me give you a situation. Let's say that your mother-in-law is coming over for dinner tonight, right? And she always finds something to criticize with you. She may wipe her finger along the windowsill. Oh my God, there's dust. Ew. Or she might not like your cooking, something like that. So you really want your partner to stand by you if she starts getting critical. All right, so here's a nice harsh way to bring it up. Dear, your mother is a wart on the back of humanity. Okay, that's really going to make you want to listen, right? I don't think so. Instead, you might say something like, honey, I'm really worried about your mom coming over tonight because she might be critical. Would you please stand by me if she does that again? Would you please stick up for me? So you're telling your partner what you need in order to help your partner shine for you. Your partner needs to know what to do. Your partner can't read your mind. So when we saw the couples who did that, this was amazing. The first 3 minutes of a conflict conversation predicted not only how the rest of the conversation would go, but with 90% accuracy, it predicted how the relationship would be 5 years down the road. The first 3 minutes of a conflict conversation. Isn't that incredible? So it's incredibly important to be able to get it right, to be able to say, I feel about what I need. Okay, so that was one of the skills. Another one was that, of course, nobody is perfect. Nobody is perfect. We always make mistakes. We will get critical. We've had a terrible day. We may call our partner an asshole or something. We make mistakes all the time in relationships. So it's not that the masters didn't make mistakes. The difference is that they repaired them. They went back to their partner later and said something like, you know what? I just was in a terrible space, and I am so sorry I said those words to you. What did it make you feel when I said them? So they would make a repair of times when they had regrettable incidents or they hurt each other. Now, in our institute, we've created a method. This is all part of our marital therapy and couple therapy. We've created a method that really takes from what those masters did in how to repair the regrettable incidents. So it's not that we avoid making regrettable incidents or hurting our partners, it's that people go back and repair them. Those are the masters. They go back and repair them. Okay. Another one is that couples would accept influence from each other. So they would say, okay, fair enough, or okay, good point, or yeah, I can see where that makes some sense, instead of constantly contradicting their partner, trying to win the argument, or get it, I'm the one who's right, you're wrong. That's the greatest kind of crevasse that couples fall into when they're having a conflict, is they try to prove that the other person's wrong and they're right. And therefore they win. But what are they winning? They're losing their connection to their partner. They may win the argument, but they lose their connection and their closeness. So the partners that were really accepting influence from each other were the ones who really stayed close over the long haul. When couples had a perpetual problem, well, what do you do with that? The masters were able to dialogue about it. They would keep just talking about it over time. And they might make little temporary compromises. So let me give you an example, with John and I, in terms of me being a little tidier, maybe just a bit, and John not tidy. Okay, so, one of the things with my wonderful man is that he really takes on a lot of projects, which means a lot of papers, a lot of books, and, they start spreading, right? They spread from the desk, and they go into the living room, and the dining room, and the kitchen, and the counter, and up in the bedroom, and they're like, they're like up the stairs. They're kind of, So we've created this beautiful system. This is always going to be a problem, right? So I can tolerate the growth of the papers and the books for about 3 weeks. And after 3 weeks, I start going crazy. And I will very gently say, John, I can't stand it anymore. Would you please clean up all these papers, please? And he'll go, okay. And he'll accept influence. Isn't that wonderful? And then he'll clean them all up. And for about 24 hours, I'll have this beautiful house, clear of clutter. It's so wonderful. And then they'll start to build up again. So I'm building up my threshold. So it's every 3 weeks. It used to be every other day. Now I'm up to 3 weeks. So, I'm getting healthy, right? So, with perpetual problems, you have to develop systems like that. So you make little temporary compromises around the edges, but you don't escalate into what we call gridlock conflict. Gridlock conflict is when couples are so opposed to each other that they get angrier and angrier, they get more and more contemptuous until they just explode. Finally, they may agree to just never talk about it again. But there it sits in the middle of the living room, and they're kind of walking quietly around it, right? It doesn't help to not talk about it. So when folks don't have the tools to be able to talk about things like big gridlock conflicts, then they get avoided eventually, and then you're distancing from one another. So, part of really being able to build a strong relationship is being able to dialogue about those big problems. And that takes us to the next level, which is called Make Life Dreams Come True. One of the things, this was so cool, I love this part, that we saw in our couples, the real masters, is that beneath their position on a gridlocked issue or a perpetual issue was oftentimes something very meaningful. It might be a piece of history that was so crucial to how they were thinking about raising their own children here and now. It might be an underlying dream that they had, or an underlying purpose or goal that they had that really fed the intensity of their position on the issue. The thing that was amazing about the masters is that they brought those out and they shared those. Let me give you an example. When I was working with couples in poverty, there was a couple, they were amazing. They were from Georgia. They were deep poor. And he was very angry at her with how controlling she was. She was very controlling, kind of domineering in the relationship. And as they were trying to process, can we shift the balance of power a little bit? She, for the first time in about 17 years of being together, she told the following story. When she was 6 years old, she lived in a ground apartment on the ground floor, and her father had abandoned the family when she was very, very little. She couldn't remember the father. And one night, while she was sleeping in her bed, the father apparently brought a diamond cutter and cut a large hole in the window, moved the glass, came into the bedroom, took her out of her bed, into his car, and drove through the night and disappeared. And she was with this father for 6 months while the mother desperately tried to find her. So as she was telling this story, she's weeping, he's amazed that she'd never told him that before. And she said, I vowed to myself that I would never let anybody control me again, right? And then he understood. It didn't make it easier for him. He still wanted there to be some balance. And once she told that story, and he really empathized with her, she could relax a little bit. But he really felt compassion for her and understood her need for control. So it wasn't about her just wanting to dominate him. It was about her not wanting to be totally out of control, which is what being out of control meant for her, being kidnapped and gone and separated from her mother at 6 years old. So you can imagine, right? You can imagine. So what we found is that couples with big gridlocked issues, when we slowed everything down And we had one person ask the other questions, specific questions, like, is there any underlying history to your position on this issue? Or, is there an underlying dream that you have? Some value in this, some value in your position on this issue? Do you have some deeper purpose or goal that's a part of your position on this issue? Wow, did we learn a lot. We learned a tremendous amount. And these couples would soften their positions with conversations like that, where they didn't try to solve it, they didn't move fast into fixing it. Instead, they sought to understand the partner first and to be understood themselves before they then moved into compromise. And that made compromise much easier. So, honoring each other's dreams, making life dreams come true, is part of what we work on within the conflicts that people have, as well as when people voice what their dreams are. So part of a really good relationship is sharing what is your underlying dream. What is it that you deeply yearn for? That's something that needs to be communicated with each other. And if there's accepting of influence, then you allow your partner to pursue their dream. You support them in pursuing their dream. So I'll give you a little teeny example of that, and John is like my hero for this. When I was near 50 years old, I had the dream of, and I'd had it for about 8 years, of going to Mount Everest Base Camp. I really wanted to do that. And I love high altitude, I love mountain climbing, so that was my dream. Now, John doesn't like to go anywhere that doesn't have room service, and it's really hard to get room service at 19,000 feet. You just can't do it, right? And his first response, of course, is, are you crazy? Are you nuts? What do you want to do that for? So there was the important question, what do you want to do that for? And then he listened. It wasn't just a rhetorical comment. He really listened, and I poured my heart out to him, and by the end of it, we compromised, and I went, right? And he took care of our daughter for 4 weeks while I went. So you want to talk about honoring a dream? Isn't that fabulous? So, he was magnificent in terms of honoring my dream, and I've tried to honor his dreams too. And now a dog is part of his dream. Isn't that cool? I think that's just so cool. It's wonderful. Okay, now let's go up to the top level, creating shared meaning. Now, one of the things that we've also seen in couples, and remember, the couples that John studied were farming couples in Indiana, they were just, poor couples, middle-class couples, all kinds of couples from all over the country that he was studying. And one of the things that he found that was so magnificent is that every person is a philosopher. No matter what their education, no matter what their friggin' IQ is, every person is a philosopher. We are meaning makers. We are meaning makers. And part of what we saw in our couples who were real successes in their relationship is that they created shared meaning. They shared with each other their underlying purpose for being alive, their underlying sense of what it means to be a human being. Why am I alive today? There was an amazing psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl. How many of you have heard of him? Yay. Cool. So Viktor Frankl, as you know, was Jewish. He was in concentration camps during the war. He was in Dachau for 3 years. And one of the things that he found in talking to lots of people in Dachau is that the people who survived better were the ones who had a sense of meaning and purpose for staying alive. And it wasn't just, to feed themselves. It usually involved wanting to reconnect with somebody else. So everyone is a meaning maker. And the important thing is that in relationships, people need to share with one another what is important to them, what's at the heart, at the core of who they are, what's most meaningful. What legacy do they want to leave behind when they're gone? How many of you know the answer to that for your partner? So asking questions like that, having a discussion with your partners about, so, why are you alive? What do you want to leave behind when you're gone? What would you like your eulogy to say? What's your purpose for the next 10 years? So that kind of sense of meaning is what couples really, who were strong, who were connected, shared with each other. They didn't have to have the same values. They just had to support their partner's right to live by those values. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's our theory. Those are the strengths. And now we're going to talk just a little bit more with John about trust and commitment.
Okay, so take a step back. Are we saying that anybody who does those 7 things, any 2 people who do those 7 things with one another, can have a great relationship? And I don't think it's true. I don't think you can take any 2 people and do this and have a successful relationship. Really, what we discovered in creating those 2 walls of the sound relationship house, the one that says trust on the left and the one that says commitment on the right, really came from understanding that love has really 3 stages to it. Now the first stage, what happens, a lot of times it doesn't happen in some cultures where, people arrange marriages. But in our culture, people fall in love. And that initial stage, when you meet somebody and you really find them right, and they smell right and taste right and feel right in your arms, and they look great, and you just have great conversations, and there's this wonderful falling in love thing that psychologists call limerence, and people really get excited and obsessed with their partner, and there's a whole bunch of neurotransmitters and hormones that are involved in that stage that are very selective. It doesn't really happen to just anybody. Very, very selective. And dopamine is secreted, and oxytocin and testosterone. And one of the things about this phase, even though it's wonderful, is that it's characterized by very bad judgment. We ignore a lot of the red flags during this falling in love phase. A second phase that happens, and this is what we saw in our newlyweds, in the beginning of relationships. This is when most of the fighting takes place in a relationship, is the first couple of years when you're building that relationship. All of the arguments that those couples had were about trust. Can I trust you? Will you be there for me if I'm upset? Am I more important than your mother, than your friends? Will you earn money for our family? Will you be a good father? Will you continue to be sexually faithful to me? Will you keep attracting? When I'm 64, like the Beatles song, will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? Those kinds of questions. That's what the arguments were about. Now, some couples really built that trust, and some couples really failed to do that. And then there's a third phase to love. And the third phase is really not about trust. It's about building commitment. And I want to tell you one little story about commitment, which really came out with this couple I was working with clinically. And I was their 6th couples therapist. And of course I thought, I'm going to be great. The other 6 have failed, but the other 5 have failed, but I'm going to be really terrific. And we were working together, and one day this couple came in and husband said, this is our last session, we're done. So they were going to fire me. And I said, well, we have a 24-hour cancellation policy, so you've already paid for this session. Would you please do me a favor and stay for the session and let me understand why my therapy has failed with you? I just, I feel I owe that to myself, and if you're willing to stay, I would really appreciate it. And they said, okay. So we talked about an argument they had that week. And this was the argument. They went to a party. Now this couple had 2 young kids, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And the wife was a therapist, and she had stopped working as much so she could really take care of the kids. And the husband had a career that was really going well. And they were getting more and more distant from each other over time with these 2 children. And they went to a party that week, and the husband said, yeah, you know what happened? I was talking to this woman at the party, and I was really having a great conversation with her, and I found her very attractive, too. And my wife tapped me on the shoulder, and she said, I'm tired, I want to go home. And I was really mad about that. I didn't want to go home. I wanted to keep talking to this woman. And on the drive home, he said to her, I found that woman a lot more attractive sexually than I find you. His wife found that kind of upsetting. And so they had a big argument, right? And I said to her, what were you thinking during that argument? And she said, what I was thinking was, who needs his crap? I wish I were with a more mature guy. This guy is just still really immature. So I said, okay, thank you very much. Now I understand why my therapy failed and why those other 5 therapists failed. You can go now. And they said, what do you mean we can go now? I said, well, you're done with this therapy, and now I understand why therapy doesn't work for you guys. So you can leave. I get it, And they said, well, can you tell us? I said, oh, okay, sure. I'd be happy to tell you. The thing is, you guys, you have a house together and you have children together and, you're married, but you're actually not married. You're actually never made the commitment. And they said, what do you mean? We made a commitment. We had wedding vows and, I said, yeah, right, but let me try to explain what commitment's about, The best way I can explain it is, in the story Alice in Wonderland, do you know that story? They said, yeah, we know that story. So, well, Alice, when she sees the white rabbit go down the rabbit hole that leads to Wonderland, she doesn't look over the hole and say, God, I don't know if I want to go down this hole. I might get my dress dirty. Maybe tomorrow will be a better rabbit. She just jumps in the rabbit hole. That's her journey. She's committed. You don't have any choice, She's going to Wonderland, and it's not all that great there. There's the Red Queen that cuts your head off, There's great stuff, too, the Cheshire Cat, and the Mad Hatter. But that's her journey. And you guys, this isn't your journey. You're always looking around for something better. You're at a party talking to an interesting person, and you think, maybe I should be with that person. Yeah. You're not in this relationship. You never married this person. And when you get in an argument, you, the wife, are thinking, oh, who needs this crap? I can do better with a more mature man. He's immature, So, you trust each other. You've done a lot of things together. You've had children together. You bought a house together. But there's no commitment in this relationship. And there's no therapist that can help you unless there's commitment. And they left. And a couple of months later, I called them up and I said, well, how are you guys? And my wife said, well, we were pretty rocked by what you said. And they were in therapy with their 7th therapist, working on commitment, okay? Commitment is really about the 3rd phase of love. It's about what makes love last a lifetime. It's about really saying, this is my journey, and this is the person I'm going to love forever. And the love is going to be very personal. And I am going to keep cherishing this person. And the difference between cherishing and not being committed is when you cherish somebody, you really decide that you are going to really magnify in your mind the positive qualities so that you nurture gratitude for what you have. And betrayal, and the opposite of commitment, and this couple was on the way to betrayal, was really to be resentful for what you don't have and to start substituting in other relationships in other ways what you think is missing in the relationship, instead of bringing up with your partner what you're upset about and trying to get your needs met in this relationship. So that third phase really is also very selective. So not everybody falls in love and has that cascade of neurotransmitters in that falling in love phase. It's very selective. Not everybody builds trust, which is the wall on the left of the sound relationship house. That's the next filter. And not everybody builds loyalty and commitment. That's the third filter that makes love last a lifetime. Thank you very much for listening.
Nice.
We'd be happy to take questions, and there are 2 microphones, so if you have a question, please go to the microphone and then we can hear you.
Why don't we sit here,
Especially
honey?
Julie can hear you.
Do you want to sit here?
Yeah, sure, we'll sit there.
Okay. See, he's accepting influence. It's good. So any questions? Yes?
Hi. Thank you so much for this. What happens when you have a disaster person with a master person? Is there such a thing?
I suppose you could say that. Somebody, for example, who expresses their needs, who does so in a gentle way, etc., and somebody else is being contemptuous and so on, or critical. So, it's a process of looking at what's going on between them. What's happening with the person who, quote unquote, is a disaster or is doing the wrong things that's keeping that person from turning towards the other person, responding defensively, let's say, instead of just listening. So it's a matter of really trying to understand what's going on with that person who might be very walled off, very defended, etc. It may be that the person who looks like a master is being a master in front of you as a therapist, but is not a master at home. So you never know, right? So what you really have to look at is what's going on between the two, work on changing, for both of them really, the ways of listening to one another, speaking to one another in terms of their needs and so on. We have, lots of methods for that. And trying not to blame. One of the big mistakes that therapists make is nailing that one. You're the one who's at fault. So when you start thinking like, well, you're a disaster, but you're a master, you're just even thinking that in your head, that can be dangerous. Because then you're blaming one person for what's wrong in the relationship, and it's never that simple.
One of the things that we did in the course of building this theory was to create a mathematical model for couples interacting. And James Murray and I wrote a book with his students called The Mathematics of Marriage. And one thing we looked at was just the kind of question you asked. What happens if you have somebody who's just really kind of nasty and they start harshly, and you have another person who really is good at communication. And it turns out that actually that kind of marriage can work very well as long as the positive person acts as enough of a buffer that you can tolerate a bit of negativity. But if the negativity grows, right, then it falls apart. So you can actually precisely set how negative that disaster person has to be. It passes a certain threshold, and then the relationship goes down the tubes. But if they don't go down that threshold, the marriage is fine. And there's a lot of research, for example, on happy marriage where one person is very depressed. And the other one turns out to be very nurturing, very giving, and it can work very well.
Thank you. I guess I'm wondering, what is the disaster master effect? Is that a function of the relationship or the people in it, their skills, or?
It's it's
So in other words, would a disaster relationship, would one of the people do better with another person, or are they going to be that way always?
It's a bit of both. For example, there's one gene that's been discovered in men, and if a guy has one copy of the gene, he tends to be in a happy marriage. If he has two copies of the gene, he's in a conflicted marriage. If he has three copies of the gene, he's alone. So, there's where biology comes in, and some people make more oxytocin than other people, so they're more naturally bonding. And personality traits, if people are more agreeable and more flexible and less neurotic, they'll be better in any relationship. So it's a bit of both. It's a bit of the individual, and it's also what happens when they're together as well.
Okay, so you would think that a disaster person might have a chance in another relationship?
Could be, yeah, it could happen. Yeah.
You never know.
We've seen it happen.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, certainly one person may be a disaster because for example, they're really needing the other person to help financially support the family. And the other person really wants to, let's say, stay home with the kids. And so, that disaster is really a disaster because they are not getting their needs met. They're feeling tremendous pressure in order to, provide for the family themselves alone, and they really resent the other person's kind of taking the opportunity to be the stay-at-home parent when they too would like to be, more involved with the kids. But, so they're very angry about that, and if things are not changing, even though that stay-at-home parent is very good at expressing their feelings and so on, but they're still not getting their needs met, that's going to create a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, criticism, perhaps, and blame. But if that person pairs with somebody else who really does want to financially provide as well as be a co-parent, etc., then, you could have a very different relationship. So, there's all kinds of different scenarios you can think about.
But actually, you can exactly calculate the threshold at which you should bail out of that relationship if you're the master.
You can.
Yes. It's a little scary, but,
Mathematically.
the mathematics tells you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I wish I had a nickel for every time I've heard this comment, and usually it's when I'm meeting with one member of the couple individually, and the comment is, I still love her or him, I'm just not in love with her or him anymore. And, you want to go through a whole book of, the hormones and all that and telling them that, but that's not going to do any good. So I'm just wondering, do you get that, and what do you do with it?
We hear that all over the world from clinicians, that question. And what do you do in that situation?
We have different answers.
We probably have different answers to that question.
Go ahead,
so
you start.
I'll let the boss go first.
I thought you were going to start.
No, go ahead.
You've already started. Go ahead,
me to go
sweetie.
first? Okay.
Sure.
So, part of what you need to do when somebody is feeling that way, it's easy to be glib, but there are a lot of reasons why people don't feel in love anymore. And of course, nobody ever has that big cascade of all those hormones when you're falling in love that lasts. It really can't last, otherwise, people would perish. They can't live at that level of intensity, it's nice for a little while, and some people, become addicted to it, and they want to have it over and over again. And they never progress to the second phase, of love. But really, the second and third phases are really quite wonderful, and there's still a lot of testosterone and oxytocin and dopamine as well in that. So you have to kind of understand what the story is. You have to be a little bit like Sherlock Holmes, and try to really solve the mystery, because it was there once, right? There was in love or she was in love, and now they're no longer in love. They feel attached. But so what's the story of what happened? I remember one couple I saw where that was the wife's major complaint. It's often the husband's major complaint, the man's major complaint, but in this case, the wife's major complaint, and what I discovered, because we measure physiology during our assessment phase, was that this woman's heart rate was at such a high level. She was secreting adrenaline. Her heart was pumping hard. She was at such a high state of anxiety, and we measure this with, the symptom checklist 90, their Gaddis scale. So she was way above cutouts. There was no way this woman could feel any desire because her physiology was being run at such a high level. She was so much in fight and flight that there was no way this woman could enjoy a novel, or savor a delight in a meal, So there was a case where it was very clear that the anxiety had to come down. Medication was very important in this. Self-soothing, learning how to self-soothe, biofeedback was very important. So you can't always say, well, this is the problem, right? But in most cases, that situation exists because people have not nurtured the romance in the relationship. Sex has become the last chore of the day. Life has become an infinite to-do list. And the couples really don't take time for one another and really, do things that, are very romantic. And a lot of times people say, well, you want to be spontaneous. You don't want to plan this. But during courtship, we're hardly spontaneous. We figure out what perfume we're going to wear or what cologne we're going to wear, what music we're going to have on, which candles we're going to light, what the meal's going to be. The seduction is planned and it's delicious, And we can keep doing that throughout the relationship, all three phases of love. You can keep that alive. You can keep playfulness alive. You can keep adventure alive. You can have getaways and dates and, really nurture romance. And some cultures do that. A lot of Hispanic cultures do that as well. Make that a priority. And talking about sex is a very important part of that as well. So if you do that, then love changes and you stay in love. But the three phases are all very different. And I think the third phase is the best of all. That'd be my answer. How would you answer?
I would probably, I think we're pretty much in line, actually.
Wow.
I know, it's a miracle, isn't it?
I never agree.
Well, first of all, you mentioned that you have an individual that you're seeing, and she's talking about, or he's talking about the relationship. Well, first of all, you never know what's going on in a relationship when you're seeing an individual. You've got to see both people.
Oh, that's a good point, yeah.
Right? Having some time alone with each, right. Okay. So, typically, I always really want to ask, so what does love mean and what does in love mean to you? A lot of times people will say, but I still love him or her, when actually they don't. They'll say it because they feel, guilty about the loss of feeling, and they're also a little worried about your judgment as a therapist. They want to be seen as a loving person. They don't want to be seen as a person who stops loving somebody. What does that mean about them? And so, you have to really explore, what does it really mean that you love this person? What is that? Well, we have shared history together. Okay. We've raised kids together. Okay. Well, what does that leave you feeling about your partner, with your partner? So you're asking questions like that. And I really agree with you, sweetie, that, typically people fall, quote unquote, out of love because there's been so much turning away from each other. They haven't been making bids for connection. They haven't been really talking openly about what their needs are. They haven't been reaching for one another. Perhaps there's been some emotional injury in the relationship that has really hurt them big time, and they've never processed it They've just said, okay, the past is the past, I'll go on. But they've never recovered from those emotional injuries. Could have been one of them, was very, very ill, and the other one went to play golf instead of coming to the hospital. Things like that. So I start looking for those emotional injuries when I hear somebody say, I don't love him anymore, or I'm out of love. Those emotional injuries lead people to pull back, withdraw, stop needing, feel resentful, feel unsafe, and not trust. And you can't stay in love with somebody that you don't trust.
Well, how many times do you think that there's already an affair going on when you hear that?
I don't know. I don't always think there's an affair. They may be thinking about just getting out. Just getting, it's not worth the trouble anymore. Especially women. I'm not really sure. Yeah,
I always suspect that maybe that's what's going
there
on.
might be.
That's a justification.
Okay. Yes.
Hi. You may have answered this with your emotional injury thing, but if you were a couple that was together for 5 years and you recently split up because you thought that you weren't going to make each other happy in the long run, and now you recognize the Four Horsemen, can you repair that relationship, or is it best to just move forward?
That's a great question. Did all of you hear that question? Yeah? Okay. So, should you just move forward, or now that you realize the Four Horsemen were there, should you try and repair it? It depends on what the partner wants, too, right? So if the partner is still longing for the relationship, you're missing parts of the relationship, or that somebody is missing parts of the relationship, there's still a kind of a wondering. The Four Horsemen can definitely be repaired. The emotional injuries that have occurred from the Four Horsemen can definitely be repaired. As long as both people want the repair. One person can really want to make a repair. The other person has, I'm done. I don't want to repair anything. Go away. So then, no matter how much you want to repair it, you can't repair with one. You got to repair with two. So doing repair work takes one person or both people actually being willing to accept some responsibility in most cases for what went wrong, kind of the pattern that evolved, the escalations that evolved in terms of the Four Horsemen. And both people need to be able to receive the repair the other person is making, right? Sometimes the emotional injury is so big that to receive the repair means making yourself vulnerable again. And that feels very dangerous for a while. So sometimes the repairs have to take place in little baby steps, until this, as the safety increases, from nothing to something more substantial. But that can take time, but it takes two.
We have seen quite a few couples who decide that the divorce is just not working out. And,
It's true.
And get back together again. And,
Yep, they come to our workshops.
Yeah. So sometimes breakups don't work, and you go, well, that was a bad choice. And let's reconsider this. But it needs to be a new relationship, that you build.
And affairs, for that matter, can also be repaired. That's part of the work that we
Right.
do, we've even had one couple where the guy had 57 affairs that he could remember, 3 of them where he'd really been in love with the partner. He was, big, super guy and traveled all over the world and had lots of people approach him for intimacy, shall we say. So, and they repaired. They repaired their marriage. They built marriage number 2. Marriage number 1 was burned to the ground, like Atlanta, Georgia. But number 2 they could build, and they did successfully. So, gosh, people are amazing at their own resilience and the desire to grow and to change and to want to love. And that's what, can create rebuilding of relationship.
And the triumph of hope over experience.
Ah, sweetie. Hope over despair, darling. Okay.
Hi, I have a question that is come in from an audience member who is seeing the webcast, and you just mentioned repair after infidelity, so that was their question, is how do you begin repair once there's been infidelity?
All righty. Well, first of all, the affair has to have stopped. So you cannot repair a marriage or a committed relationship if the affair is ongoing. It's impossible. There's 3 people in the room, not 2, so who you're relating to. It's a little bit tougher to heal infidelity when it's been lied about for a while. That means there's a double betrayal. The affair is the first betrayal, lying about the affair is the second. So that's a little bit harder. But to repair it, we have a method of doing so. We call it atonement, attunement, attachment. And in the atonement phase, what happens is, first of all, the individual who's been betrayed is suffering typically from post-traumatic stress disorder. They are hypervigilant. They are terrified of it happening again, so they're constantly looking for it to happen again. They're having horrible intrusive thoughts of what the affair partner was like in bed or something like that, coming into their head, whether they want them there or not. Those thoughts are coming into their head. And some of the time they're emotionally numb, other times they're exploding. So no wonder it's such a roller coaster, right? So they need to, first of all, understand that that betrayed partner is suffering from PTSD, and it's going to be a while before they can get over, or at least tame down, the symptoms of PTSD. Secondly, people who've had an affair need to kind of open up the wall of secrecy that has existed between them that's allowed the affair to happen. What that looks like is the betrayed person needs to be able to ask the other person lots and lots of questions about how it started, where, when, how much did you spend, things like that. So that person who's been betrayed needs to ask questions. The other person needs to answer the questions. Also, the person who's done the betraying needs to be able to hear the betrayed partner's emotions. And we're not talking about hearing criticism and contempt, right? We're talking about hearing the pain, the anger, the loss, the despair, the hopelessness, the rage, the tremendous fear that it will happen again. What it's meant to that other person without getting defensive. Then, as that process unfolds and slowly kind of dwindles over time, that may take a while, then you can begin to look at how to really listen to each other, really attune to each other's needs, how to empathize with each other, how perhaps in the marriage there were ways that both people were turning away from each other, not just maybe one, though one was doing some betraying with somebody else. So really attuning to each other means rebuilding ways of connecting with one another that have meaning. Finally, attachment really means making more commitment to the relationship and finding ways of creating even deeper safety, more trust, more commitment, and ways of really connecting again that have the deepest meaning, where they really feel safe with one another. So all of that takes time. Okay?
2 clarifications. First of all, when you were talking about stonewalling and you asked the guy what he was thinking in his head when he was stonewalling, did you mean that he was saying to himself, just shut up? Okay, all right. So that makes a lot more sense to me. And then, Julie, when you were just talking about, a woman asking questions, for example, about when did this affair start, how much money did you spend, that brought up the question for me of, I've heard some therapists really feel strongly that it should not be about the details of the sexual relationship. It should not be about what did you do exactly, and then what did you do, because then you just have those pictures in your head. Would you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. That is part of what we say. Yeah.
Okay.
So asking, it's a risk to ask deeper questions about the actual sexual acts they committed together. Because it produces more images that intensify the PTSD and that plague that person. So we encourage folks to ask lots of questions, but not those.
Would you apply that same model to a couple coming together where one has a history of having affairs with past relationships, but the current relationship they're in, they're not having an affair at all? And the person has a vicarious trauma, I guess, from past decisions?
So what, I'm not sure what you're asking.
So a couple coming together, there's been no infidelity or anything like that, but one partner is aware that the other partner has had affairs in the past, like with past relationships.
And
they're
so-
worried and they have trust
And
issues.
they're worried.
Yeah.
They're worried. They have trust issues. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So, yeah, certainly there's going to be some questions about whether or not they can trust that person if the person has a pattern of betrayal. So there may be a lot of testing going on, in that relationship. And one of the key things that the therapist might encourage the partner to ask, the one that they're afraid will have an affair, is what went wrong in these relationships that you had affairs? And if he or she hears, well, my partner was so immature, or my partner was, just sexually, she gained a lot of weight and so I wasn't attracted to her, In other words, if that person is blaming the partner for the fact that he or she had affairs, that's a bad sign. Right? Okay.
Yeah, I would add one thing is that the great thing that Shirley Glass did in the book she wrote called Not Just Friends was to take this whole area of affairs and deception out of the pulpit, out of the church, and take the horns and tails off people who do that, because it happens so often, and really to try to understand the process through which these things happen very, very frequently. And part of, what's hard to trust a person who has had affairs in the past is really not understanding this whole process. So a lot of what you could do is really read Not Just Friends and see what it is that Shirley Glass has discovered about the process, the sort of how mundane it all is, how people give each other permission to cross boundaries because they're afraid of bringing up conflict. They're afraid of conflict. Americans are afraid of conflict. And, in every affair there's conflict avoidance, and there's the failure of disclosing your unhappiness to your partner and trying to get your needs met in this relationship and going, okay, I don't want to rock the boat, So a lot of this is very mundane. It's not because people are just fundamentally untrustworthy or they're evil people. There are some evil people, but for the most part, I think understanding the process is very important. And then you can build a kind of relationship that doesn't have betrayal, that has commitment and loyalty, if you understand the process.
Good. One last question?
Yes, good evening. If you're doing premarital counseling, say, and you've got a wedding coming up in 3 months, or you know they want 6 sessions so that their pastor will sign off and marry them, and if you see a potential train wreck is going to come out of this relationship, do you try to practice tools to help them salvage the relationship? Are you more honest and assertive with your feelings on this isn't going to go right? If maybe one of them's a practicing alcoholic, do you try to work on their dysfunction? How would you roll with that type of activity?
I've had cases like that, and I think it's really helpful to be honest about the challenges that the relationship has, that you see, being a wiser person, having more experience, and, because when you're in that first phase, you really ignore those red flags, and they may not want to look at it. They may want to think only about which band to have and what the wedding cake should look like, and the honeymoon, and think everything's going to work out okay. But I think if you say to them, look, you should be aware that these red flags are going to come up, you're going to notice them, and leave the door open so that they can trust you and come back and see you and say, Pastor, you were right. A lot of these things have come up and we don't know how to handle them. We need help. I think that's what I would do.
Well, he's got 6 sessions, he said. So, I agree with John that, being honest is great, and then seeing how do they want to proceed in terms of the 5 remaining sessions, that they have. So if they really want to work on the relationship, if they want to work on change, and they show that they want to work on change by doing so during those 5 sessions, maybe, especially if somebody is a practicing alcoholic, depending upon how long the couple has already been together, if the other person is not, then they are probably feeling quite a mask over their alcoholic partner's heart that they can't reach.
True.
The alcohol prevents them from really deeply connecting with their partner, and so they may already, if they've been together long enough, before thinking about marriage, they may already feel some emotional distance. And that perhaps really needs to be addressed in terms of the relationship and the fact that they're already starting to feel lonely, in order to see whether or not the other partner feels the alcohol is more important to them than connecting with their partner. And not that, I'm a firm believer in alcoholism being a disease, and part of that disease is denial. So, you might want to be with somebody who's a practicing alcoholic, really talking during those sessions about what that other partner is experiencing as their practicing alcoholic partner gets loaded every night or whenever. And also, what's triggering the other person to turn towards the alcohol? What's going on for them that they reach for a drink? So, exploring that as an issue might be important. So, on that wonderful note...
Thank you for coming.
Thank you
for
so
listening.
much for coming.
A lot of fun.